Hey everyone, my name is Matt, or Cryptic if you prefer. In this video, we're going to be going over the modeling process that I spent to make the Darth Vader lightsaber. This was a remake of an old project that I made back in about 2019, and looking back on it, I wasn't super thrilled with it. There were a lot of issues with it technically, and all in all, it just didn't look that great, nor did it look that accurate to like the original movie prop. So I wanted to go through and really spend some time using the new skills that I've learned over the years and just kind of refresh this model and kind of this project. The biggest thing that I wanted to highlight this time around was the actual control of edge flow and working with cylindrical objects, which in the past I had not done well. If you look at the old model, you can see a lot of pinching and a lot of bending that just shouldn't have been there. Now I have a new process for adding hard surface detail to my models, especially when it comes to being a cylindrical model. So I spent a lot of time making sure that these indents not only look smooth, but when the object itself was actually smoothed and completely cleaned out, it wasn't pinching anywhere and you didn't see any noticeable bumps that were going through the mesh. This really helped in creating these fairly dense details. It did increase the polygon count quite a bit on the model itself, but it in the end I think had a better look than the original, and it got me the result that I was looking for. There isn't anything super special about this, it's just making sure that you control your edge flow in a way that makes sense and in a way that services the final model and the final render. Again, the biggest thing I was trying to avoid here was just pinching and then some of the overall visual issues that you can see in the original model. I think a lot of time is spent really focusing on keeping a mesh from getting as dense as possible, and in certain scenarios you kind of can't avoid that. There are ways to do this, and this could end up being something like a texture, or if you wanted to use some sort of displacement or bump map to kind of fake these details. If you weren't going to get super close to the object, you absolutely could go about that route. But with this project, I wanted to make sure that I had as much detail as possible, as well as making sure that it looked very much the same as the movie prop, or at least the reference for the prop that I was using. When it came down to it, it was pretty hard to find actual reference that shows what these points are, like what these are for. Like you can see that there are wires that go into it, but it doesn't necessarily give you a good indication on whether or not they actually like go through the model. So I just settled with leaving them as indents and then painting them black later in the process. This was another complicated part because I had to figure out how to add these little boxes. Again, this could have been done with a texture, but in the spirit of making this an entirely hard surface model, I wanted to make sure I got that detail in there. And after adjusting some of the edge loops that I added to clear up any weird lines going through the model, I think the end result was pretty solid. There really weren't any major issues that stuck out to me, especially when I applied the metal texture to it. Really, this came down to just being super careful with controlling the way the edges actually flowed across the model and making sure that I wasn't adjusting the outer edges of the model, which would lead to it no longer looking circular or cylindrical. Looking back on the old model, there were a lot of things that I skimped on and a lot of mistakes I made. One of them was not making sure things were centered and set up properly, as well as ignoring the way things were functionally built. I think a big problem with a lot of modeling today is that people don't look at the way that something is functionally constructed. They kind of just create haphazard ways to make it look pretty similar, but they ignore a lot there. And I think to some extent that might not be the best idea. I enjoy adding as much mechanical detail as I can to make it feel believable and look believable, but in the end, it does come down to like if you're dealing with things like a polygon budget or any number of issues that you could come across while you're modeling something like this. But for this case, I wanted to make sure I had all of the detail possible, and that included making sure it looked functionally usable. If you're familiar with the way the lightsabers are kind of built, they're stacked and clamped and closed up together. So I wanted to make sure that as I was building this, I was looking at the functionality of it and making sure that, yeah, it would clamp down on this button. You would screw in the little clamp itself and then actually fold it down. So I spent a good amount of time making sure that I was trying to match the reference that I had as well as possible, while also not I also just wanted to make sure that I wasn't doing it to the point where it was going to just delay the project and make it to where the detail was never perfect enough, or there was never enough detail. At some point as an artist, you do have to decide, like, okay, this is where I skip a corner, or this is where I kind of just fake it. There were some points on this model where I decided, like, this is just time to fake it. It's time to move on. I can't spend too much time with this. The button, I think I got fairly accurately, but I can tell there was some sort of like functional feature that I missed, but I just don't have enough reference to actually show what it did. So that just became something that I was like, you know, I have to end it here and I have to just keep going. One of the big things with the original model that I screwed up on was the clamp itself. I didn't really look at the reference to establish, oh, you know, this is clearly a screw that's going through two plates and it's actually clamping the lightsaber together instead of just being this weird non-functional detail. This time around, I wanted to make sure I really followed that and I made sure that it was matching the reference. A lot of this project itself was built on cylindrical objects, so there weren't a lot of other standard shapes used in it, aside from, I think, a few cubes. Other than that, the only complex pieces of mesh in this project were the sweep meshes that were used to create the wires. Otherwise, everything was a very cylindrical workflow, and you can see that I spend some time making sure that I quad my cylinders off. It's kind of just a personal preference to me. I don't necessarily know if it's super required, but I tend to just do it because it kind of makes life easier in the long run. It doesn't really increase speed when it comes to UV or anything like that, but for me, it just comes down to like a personal, this is what I usually do when I'm modeling, because I don't like the single points. And when you smooth those single point meshes like that, you tend to get some really weird issues that you can avoid entirely by just making sure you're quadding them out. I was having an issue with the mirroring here, and it turns out that with certain objects, if you're working on them and you didn't delete the history or the transformation data, you will see issues with the mirror not working properly, which is why it kept kind of trying to mirror in like a weird shape. I don't run into that too much anymore, but every once in a while it does pop up. This was a detail that I wasn't necessarily like super sure I wanted to add, but again, it came down to wanting to add too much detail and making it mechanically sound. So this would be like a little rubber pad that would be underneath that clip. So when you push down that clip, that rubber pad pulls up and kind of just closes everything together. Was it necessary to add? No, probably not, but I enjoy having it, and I think it did kind of lend itself to the final model. Again, I think one of the best things that I did, that I focused on with this project, was making sure I was actually working with keeping everything centered and not allowing myself to just kind of willy-nilly slap things together. I know a lot of us, when we're working, we can tend to do that, and in the long run, I think it was much more helpful that I had a nice center point to work with on most of these things. Right here, I didn't. I kind of cheated it here, but for the most part, I made sure I kept to center. That way that I knew my object, when it was built, was actually configured in a way that made sense, and it all kind of slid together. This was another detail I wasn't necessarily sure about. There are a couple different variants on these lightsabers if you look at them throughout the internet. So I just kind of settled on this one because it looked the best to me. It kind of made sense. Yeah, I figured it would be some sort of like lighting feature or something like that, but it always was a clear piece of plastic. So whether or not this is the actual way the button looked, couldn't really find much information on, but from the kind of officially licensed models that I found from places like Saber resellers and things like that, this was as close as I could get to it. And you can see with the old model, I just kind of threw a bunch of stuff together, and honestly, I didn't really know back then about circularized tool or about many of the tools that I was using for this. I just really kind of tried to build things as quickly as possible and make nice things. And while that's fun, it doesn't mean that it's technically the best idea. So that's just one of the things that I've learned over the years, is that, you know, spend the time, make sure that what you're doing is correct, and it's not going to cause you problems later in the, you know, later down the road. If I had like actually UV'd the old model, I don't even know how that would have worked out, but I can guess that it would have been a nightmare. This was one of the decisions that I made where I wanted to make this detail. I wanted to have this kind of knurling in the back, but I didn't want to continually add detail to this piece. So I decided to make it its own separate cap, because looking at reference, you could tell there was some sort of like center pin screw. So what I did is I ended up making this like a kind of like an insert, and then you would have a secondary pin screw, which gets modeled next, that would technically cap the thing off and put it all together. If this were a toy, it would be where you put your batteries, obviously. One of the things that I really tried to make sure I was doing was kind of keeping as simplistic as possible. I didn't want to add too much unnecessary detail, because I did want to let some of the texturing take care of that work for me. So when it comes to most of these objects, they're pretty simple and just supported and smoothed objects. This was one thing that I wasn't necessarily sure about. The grip seems to change configurations on most concept arts or most reference images. So it really depends on which one you're looking at, but I chose this grip configuration just because it matched some officially licensed ones. So I wanted to make sure I was staying relatively close to the original design, and I feel like I got it here. Not that it would be very comfortable to hold this thing, but I feel like it's much more accurate to the original prop. And then here's where I kind of messed up. Instead of just mirroring these across and doing a rotational duplicate, I decided to do it myself. Wasn't necessarily the best idea, but at the same time, I was kind of tired, wasn't really thinking about it, so I just kind of made it look as best as I could and called it good. And I don't think you can really tell much of a difference there, but otherwise there are better automated ways to do that. And here's something that I don't usually do. Making screw details are still one of the things that I struggle with the most, and a lot of people will just use textures for them. But this is a way that I learned to create screws that were pretty fast and effective. They're not the easiest to set up topology-wise for smoothing, but on a detail so small like this, I just decided that it wasn't really necessarily something I had to like deep dive into and get perfect, because the likelihood that you'll even notice these is pretty low unless I'm doing some really close-up shots, which I didn't plan on doing for this model itself. And then the same thing happened here. I just took them and duplicated them across because I didn't want to spend too much time here. I did angle them a little bit to make it look like, you know, they're not all perfect, because in 3D I think we spend a little bit too much time making things perfect instead of making things look natural. And if you're ever working on an item, you'll notice that screws don't always turn and end in the exact spots where they should. And so here I'm just using the sweep curve, the curve tool, and then creating a sweep mesh. I find that that's the easiest way to make pipes and wires, and you get really good results really quickly, and then the only thing you have to do is cap them off. I made a mistake here and I added too many outer loops, so I did kind of just cheat it and add another loop and then call it good, but not a detail you're going to really notice at all. Sweep meshes are super powerful for creating cables, pipes, anything you can really think of. There are multiple other ways to do pipes as well, but sweep meshes to me seem like the fastest way that I've found to do them. And I just always recommend people use them, especially over the old ways of extruding along a curve. And so here's where there's a funny story. You'll see me kind of planning this and then starting it out, and then you'll see that suddenly there's a model there. The reason that that's there is because early in the process, I built it out, and then I finished by building out this back portion right here. The problem is that when I saved my model, I did not delete the history or freeze the transformations. And Maya 2025, which is what I'm currently using, tends to have a weird issue where when you save, if you didn't do those things, it corrupts your file. And you'll see a little example of it here in a moment. But basically, I had to go back and completely remodel that. I'm actually happier with the way the second version came out, but I was unhappy that I had to remodel the entire piece. And this was a piece that didn't get corrupted, so it got left behind, as well as all of these little bolts and external details. I was really good about clearing those, and I just didn't do it on the most complex part, so that's why you'll see it kind of corrupt here in the next step here. And then I'm not really sure what happened right here, but when I was going down and extruding things, I guess I still had the faces up top selected, and I deleted them. So I'm just going through and just bridging the connections and cleaning it up again. I think a lot of the time we get so into modeling that sometimes we just forget and we start running through things and you forget what you last had selected, and sometimes you delete it, and that's what I did there. So these are just two little basic knobs and pins that go on the back of this thing. I did notice while I was editing this video that I didn't quad out the bottom of this one. Not that it really matters, because it's hidden, but just a fun little tidbit of info, I guess. And then this is where I started to add the detail for where the D-ring goes. And then once I get that D-ring added in, you can see what happens. Actually, if I remember correctly, it happened after this guy. So this is just creating a simple knurling pattern on this, because there are two types of screws on the back of the lightsaber, and if you look at them, one of them has that like unique knurling that hardware or gym equipment will have sometimes. At some point here, I ended and I saved for the day, and then when I came back, my my model was corrupted, unfortunately. And that's the thumb screw, and you can see right there, there's a good example of the corruption that happened. And again, this just seems to be an issue with Maya 2025. I don't really know what happened, and this is me discovering that issue and being really sad that I had to remake that whole thing. But now this is the one that ended up in the final model, just because I wanted to make sure that I went back and showed that process. I didn't want to show it twice because it wouldn't make sense, and it was, I think the first time I spent probably 20 or 30 minutes on it. So the second time I was much more prepared to actually build it out and get it finished faster. And this is a really weird shape, because originally in the old model I had it as like 3 different pieces because I wasn't sure how to build a shape like this. But if you look at it, it is one forged piece. It's one actual item, so it's not in a bunch of different pieces. So I wanted to make sure that I was mimicking that, and it ended up being a very weird piece to make and had some strange issues with it along the way, but otherwise I think the end result came out really nice. And I was really happy with the way the edges flowed. Everything just kind of worked with it the second time around. First time around, the model I was not super thrilled with. And there's some of those hidden faces that pop up every once in a while when you're modeling in Maya. You'll probably notice that I do this a lot too. I've stopped really, I used to extrude a lot, so I would extrude inward, and you could probably accomplish that now with the Smart Extrude tool. I just choose to kind of do it the manual way. I didn't really enjoy trying to smash things together and then just end up deleting faces anyway to kind of re-add them. So really what I wanted to make sure I was doing is finding a different way of doing it. And to me, it seemed more of a good idea to just delete the faces and then kind of rebuild the geometry underneath it. And it worked out pretty well. And you see I do this the same for the little curved piece at the front that holds the D-ring. I just find this is a much better way to kind of control the flow of your polygons in every kind of structure that you're adding to this, it really does help kind of establish the way things are supposed to work. And for me, it works out better in the long run. One of the big things I kind of debated on is whether or not I wanted to add these holes, and I ended up deciding that, yeah, I wanted to get them added just in case. It wasn't really a necessary detail. I could have texture painted something in and it probably would have looked just as fine. But again, I'm a glutton for punishment, so I just enjoy adding way too much detail. And so I added those pinholes, and yeah, I can increase the geometry a little bit, but in the end, I don't think it really bothered me. The only thing I will say is I did have some triangles up top here. I felt like they were kind of unavoidable, but they ended up smoothing out perfectly and not really causing any issues. So I left them because they're not necessarily something that I try to avoid like the plague as much as like say an Engon. But sometimes I think a triangle is and can be used to your advantage in modeling. And so I just left them because it helped me create this edge loop here and then just terminate it off. And then we're doing the same thing here. We're using just a curve and a sweep mesh. What I did do is I duplicated the curve and basically mirrored it and then connected it to create the D-ring. That way I didn't have to have like two weird oblong sides. And then from there I just used the sweep mesh again to create that nice D-ring that we have in the final model. Nice thing if you didn't know with sweep meshes is as long as you leave the curve inside the sweep mesh, you can still adjust the sweep mesh with the curve. And it will actually retain a lot of the detail. Once you delete that curve though, that's kind of the end of it. You've kind of set it in stone and you're stuck there. This was another area that I was kind of confused about. It's really hard to find reference images of the front or inner portions of lightsabers. So I found one that was as close as I could get to like the front view of it, and I just tried to mirror that detail as much as possible. And this was one of the places where I got a little bit lazy. With this extra ring that I added, you can see that I added one too few outer edge rings, and so because of that I have one segment in this that technically isn't too wide, and you'll see it coming up here in just a second because I just was not paying attention, but I left it because I did not want to deal with it. And that goes to show you too, like small details like that, people are really never going to notice it. Like had I not mentioned it, you probably wouldn't have noticed it. That's it for this video. The next one dropping will be UV mapping. This project was actually fairly difficult to UV map, especially with all the cylindrical shapes and everything like that. But I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. It does help me grow the channel. And I will see you all in the next video.